Trimming pots can be a tricky process. There are lots of subtleties and timings you need to get right for the procedure to go as smoothly as possible. So, in this video, I want to discuss the process in real depth. I'm going to be talking about the pot and the tools, together with some tips and tricks and small things I do along the way to make this process easier. When learning to trim, it can feel as if you're ruining lots of well-thrown pots, but it's worth knowing that that's completely normal. Usually trimming comes at a point when your throwing skills are already developed, yet trimming itself is a totally new skill and it needs a different approach and a different mindset. The first thing you have to get right is the clay's condition. It needs to be leather hard and on the firmer side if possible. You should be able to pick up, prod and move around the pot without the walls distorting, nor should the clay be sticky or should you be able to leave fingerprints in it when you touch it. And if when you're trimming the turnings stick immediately back onto the pot, then that's just another sign that the clay is too soft to be working with. Trimming is one of those processes where if you attempt to do it when the clay is too soft or too firm, you actually make the process more difficult than it has to be. So catching it at this perfect moment, when it's leather hard, not turning bone dry, and definitely not too soft, is absolutely critical. So here we are with the pot on the wheel, and the first thing I do is pick it up to feel the weight, and then I run my fingers over the walls to feel the cross section. I can feel that there's more clay in the base, and then the walls get thinner as they move upwards. Essentially, all I'm doing here is gathering data which will inform me when I trim the pot, as I know where to focus my trimming, such as where I shouldn't remove too much, or where more needs to be removed, such as the foot on this piece. Before I begin though, let's weigh this piece, as it's always interesting to see just how much material is removed throughout this process. At this point it's 829 grams, which is about 1 pound and 13 ounces. Now, the first thing I have to do is arguably the most difficult part, and that's centering this pot on the wheelhead. When I first learnt how to trim pots, I was told to use these rings on the wheelhead to help. You can see that if I place the pot down and spin the wheel, the gap between the pot's rim and the white ring undulates, and this is because the pot is slightly off center. So, what I do is find this point where the pot is furthest off center and I push it inwards, just a little bit, and then I repeat the process again. I identify the spot where the bowl is closest to that line, and then I push it just by a few millimeters away from it. And essentially, I just keep doing this until the pot spins perfectly in the middle, and that gap between the lip of the pot and the white ring on the wheelhead is even all the way around. At which point the pot, as long as it's been thrown evenly and was properly centered at that stage, should spin without any undulations in the walls, which I can see both visually and by running a finger up and down the walls. Equally, instead of using the rings on the wheelhead, you can just hold your finger steady, like this. You can then identify the part that spins around closest to your finger and push it away from that until the piece becomes more and more centered. Once again, it's worth stating that if you don't properly center your pots, you're actually making the process more difficult than it has to be, as if the walls are undulating really badly, it'll be much more difficult to hold your trimming tools steady, as the wavering walls will mean you constantly have to change the pressure you're trimming with, and the walls of the pot themselves will end up dictating how you trim, whereas in actuality you need to be the one in control. The way I actually center fundamentally takes a lot of what I just spoke about into consideration, but applies it in a slightly different way. I still look for that uneven spot between the rim and the white line, but instead of stopping the wheel and pushing it gently with my hands, I give it a sharp tap. And I keep tapping until the pot spins in the center. And I can feel when it's on center by letting my hand run over the pot, or by looking at the rim and watching how it spins in relation to the other rings on the wheelhead. But essentially I'm just hitting the pot wherever it spins the most off-center. Tap centering can be quite difficult to learn. You just have to remember the basic principles of where and when you strike it, and very quickly it will become intuitive and you simply won't think as you're doing it. One thing you can do to make this process easier and safer is to apply light pressure downward with your left hand. This pins the pot down and prevents you from over-tapping it, which is when you strike it past the central point. And so with just a tiny amount of pressure pushing down, I can make sure the pot stays in the right place as I tap center it. Tap centering can also be done the other way around, simply by striking the base in much the same way as I was striking the rim earlier. I identify the side where it's projecting out the most and then tap it into the middle. I'm pushing down with the fingers of my left hand to keep the pot in place, but it can be slightly trickier centering this way up, as often the rims of pots will be slightly uneven, and even when perfectly centered, there could be a very subtle undulation in the rim. But instead of focusing on that, you sort of have to observe the whole vessel and get the entire piece spinning on its most central axis. I will be trimming the inside of this pot just to neaten it up slightly, and the way I attach the pot down to the wheel is by brushing some slip around the circumference of the base. I then place it down as centrally as I can and then tap center the vessel so it spins in the very middle of the wheel. The friction from the tapping combined with the slip holds the pot down firmly. And finally, I just use the corner of one of these rubber kidneys, which you'll see me using quite a lot throughout this video, just to squash some of the excess clay around the base into the metal, helping to stick it down even more securely. I can give the pot a really good shake and try to move it off center, but it just won't. And if you are trying this, just remember to not use too much slip, as if there is too much, the piece will just hydroplane off the wheelhead, so use it sparingly. For this initial bit of trimming, which is refining really, as my aim isn't to remove much material, I'm going to be using these cheap stainless steel trimming tools. They cost a few pounds each, and the metal wears away as the abrasive clay grinds against them. But they leave lovely, smooth and burnished surfaces when used, and they can really take a beating, which makes them wonderful tools to learn with, as you don't have to be so precious with them compared to some I'll use later. Now the first and most important thing to discuss about turning tools is how you hold them. You definitely don't want to hold them by the end like this with a very loose grip, as it will be really difficult to apply enough pressure horizontally into the pot to remove any meaningful amount of clay. You also have very little control when holding it like this, so instead you want to grip the tool very close to the blade. You also want to tuck your elbow into your torso and rest your forearm on the plastic wheel tray, all to add stability to your movements as you're trimming, as ultimately the blade itself is floating in the air with very little support, so you need to hold the tool and brace yourself in such a way that it's anchored really well and you aren't holding it limply like this. Again, trying to turn pots like this will just make the process more difficult, so you need to really grip your tools, lean your upper body weight onto your forearm to keep your hand steady and stable as you trim. For the inside of my pot, I don't want to remove much clay, rather I just want to smooth the surfaces somewhat and refine the rim so it comes to a sharper point, which visually will make the piece appear as if it's lighter and thinner, which is one of my goals with this piece. Essentially, when turning pots, the aim is to make the cross-section of the walls as even as possible from top to bottom. Inevitably, when you throw pots, there's always going to be some amount of excess clay in the lower section of the wall and the base. And via the trimming process, clay is removed from those thickest, heaviest parts, so the piece feels lighter, but perhaps more importantly, balanced. A pot can be quite thickly walled and heavy almost, as long as the weight is distributed evenly from top to bottom, so the pot is balanced. What you don't want is for all that weight to be focused in the bottom of your piece, so it feels bottom heavy. Once I've lightly trimmed over some areas, I often use a sharp piece of straight metal like this to scrape over those trimmed sections to ensure they're perfectly straight and flat, so they're in keeping with my style of work. I also use the curved portions of these plastic kidneys to shore up the curves in the base of my bowls. It can also be used in the same way the metal tool was, to scrape over the walls and to remove any remnants left from the throwing process. And lastly, for the inside, I just defined this angle here, as a sharp ledge should cause the glaze that's eventually coated over it to react more interestingly. And yes, in this case I am holding the turning tool in the way I told you not to previously, but as I'm only removing a very thin skim of clay, it works perfectly. When there are specks of clay or trimmings left inside the bowl which I want to remove, I run a piece of soft, sticky clay over the surface to pick up those last few tiny burrs of clay. I also want to just bevel the rim ever so slightly so it comes to a sharper point, which again will cause the glaze that's coated over it to break in a more dramatic way, revealing a band of colour that encircles the top. In reality, how you trim your pots has so much to do with how you're going to glaze them, and there are things that I do specifically with my work, as I know it causes the glazes I use to act in certain ways. To remove the pot from the wheel, I use the sharp tip of this metal potter's knife by sliding it underneath the base. First I use the flat end to remove that seal of clay I created earlier, and then I push the knife's edge underneath it. But first, I make sure that my left hand is ready to catch the pot, as there's a chance it can dislodge and fling off to one side. So my hand is there ready to catch it. Now the reason I don't slip the entire base when securing the pot to the wheel is that would mean I'd have to slide the knife all the way to the centre, which would make removing it actually quite difficult. And so by just slipping the outside, I only need to slide the knife beneath it a tiny amount. Next, I remove any remnants of clay from the wheel head, and this is just good practice really, as I don't want any pieces of clay lodging themselves back into the rim I just so carefully finished. I know this is sort of an exaggerated example, and this pot probably wouldn't have run into that issue anyway, but it's just good housekeeping. And in other cases, with other shapes, it might prevent you from damaging your pot and having to repair it. So with the inside trimmed, I can now begin work on the outside, which is where most of the trimming occurs. The pot is tap-centered, and in this case I want to trim right close to the rim of the pot. Now, normally this would be tricky to do, as I usually secure my pots in place with 3 pieces of soft clay, like so. But by doing this, I obviously block the area I want to trim, so I need to find another solution. In this case, that's using a spinner. This is a nylon tool with a ball bearing between the 2 parts, which means I can hold onto the black portion as the white part spins. I place the tool on top of the bowl, tap center it, which just makes holding it steady a bit easier. And then through this tool, I push down firmly, which pins the pot onto the wheel head and prevents it from skidding around as I turn the lower section of the rim. Now, for the majority of the trimming where my goal is to actually remove a considerable amount of clay, I switch to using these tungsten carbide turning tools. These are very sharp, and they maintain that edge even after trimming thousands of pots. The downsides are that these tools are quite expensive, the blades themselves are really fragile, and they are actually quite difficult to use as they tear away at the clay so aggressively. It helps if you're quite a confident trimmer before you attempt using these. I suppose the easy comparison to make is that you would never teach somebody how to drive in a sports car. These tools also don't leave as nice a surface as the steel turning tools, and instead they often leave slightly chattered, textured surfaces. So really when I use these tools, my focus is to remove material, and then I'll do a majority of the cleanup and refinement with the steel turning tools and my metal scrapers. So I hold the tool with a firm grip, push down hard from above, and then make contact. I move the blade at a slow and steady rate so it's able to trim the entirety of the walls without skipping over anything. Another really important thing to notice throughout this process is how I connect my hands. I push the thumb of my left hand against the thumb of my right hand. They're bracing against each other, and it's just another thing I do, subconsciously, to add stability to my movements and help keep that blade steady. With that part trimmed, I can now secure the pot to the wheel, which I do by pressing 3 lumps of soft clay around it, which I suppose are like the jaws you might find on a chuck on a lathe. When I press these down, I don't push them towards the bowl itself, as that could create a slight deformity in the walls of the pot. Instead, I push the lump of clay directly down and let the clay that squeezes out be the clay that holds the bowl in position. This way I'm just imparting less pressure on the rim of the pot, which can be one of the most delicate parts of the vessel. When you're learning to trim pots, it's very easy to let the blade catch and be drawn around by the rotating clay. This is why I go to so many lengths in order to keep that blade steady as I work with it. And a good way to think about it is like this. If a slight bump or undulation is in the wall, you want to hold the tool firmly enough that the blade cuts through it, causing the walls of the pot to become more true as you turn it. And what you don't want to allow to happen is for those undulations to influence your turning. As the more you allow that to happen, the more exaggerated those undulations become, and the more you lose control. Now it's time to turn the portion of the pot which needs the most clay removed. And as I'm going to be trimming quite aggressively, I really anchor my body, grip the tool firmly, and connect my hands. And you can see that there is a slight irregularity in the lower section of this pot, but I just trim right through it without letting it influence the movement of the turning tool. As there's so much clay in the foot of this piece, I want to trim a nice tall base, as if this bowl sits on a pedestal. So I switch to a smaller tool and define where I want that foot to begin. This of course means that the wall beneath it is no longer straight, and there's a step I don't want just underneath the foot. So I'll use a flat edge turning tool, which is reciprocal to the shape I want, to trim this portion and correct it. Much better. I then use my scraper just to clean up that surface. And then one thing you should never be afraid of is to remove your pot midway through the trimming process, in order to judge how much clay you've removed and just to gather some more information, especially if it's a shape you're unfamiliar with or haven't thrown many of. The walls feel pretty good, but there's still just a touch more weight I can remove from this lower section, but the foot itself and the proportions overall feel about right. So, back onto the wheel it goes, and I tap center much more gently at this point, as not only are the walls thinner, but when trimming you also expose damper clay underneath, which doesn't have as much strength. And with that done, it's time to finish the foot, which I think is the hardest part of the trimming process apart from the centering. I begin by just flattening the top, just to clear the grounds so I can see what I have to work with. And the first thing I'll do is bevel this outside edge. Here's the bowl without the bevel on a tabletop, and you can see how the pot seems to just blend with that surface, as if it's melting into it. Visually this makes the pot appear to be heavier. And to change that, I just bevel this outer edge and then burnish this outside portion and the foot with the smooth side of one of these plastic kidneys. And the difference this makes is rather striking, albeit just a subtle change. The bowl appears to float ever so slightly as the pot casts a more intense band of shadow underneath it. This also creates a point of contact that's much less likely to chip with use, as it isn't just a sharp right angle. The next step is to begin hollowing out the foot. And for this process I'm going to be using the rounded corner of this particular turning tool. But first, if this helps you, you can score a line around the base to measure the outermost part of your footwell. Now for my first 1 or 2 passes, my aim isn't to remove a ton of clay, rather it's just to set the foundations and turn up till that guide I set myself, so I know where not to trim beyond. It's so easy to make a mistake at this part, and if you accidentally gouge away too much horizontally or vertically, you can damage the pot irreparably by making a hole in the bottom of the bowl or by shredding past the foot and making it completely uneven. When trimming like this, I hold the turning tool with a fist really tightly and keep my movements very even and consistent. When you begin removing so much clay at once, all it takes is one wrong movement and for the tool to catch, and the entire pot to fling itself out of its restraints and off the wheel. Trimming with confidence like this can take years of practice, and you certainly shouldn't push yourself to imitate turning like this, when you can just take it bit by bit, removing clay layer by layer, and ultimately ending up with the same result, even if it did take a slightly longer time. Speed comes with practice. I felt like the foot ring at this point was a bit thick for my liking, so I began to remove clay horizontally, thinning out this portion of the pot so the vessel sits on a more delicate foot ring. As I approach a point where I feel like the foot might be deep enough, I periodically check the thickness by pressing down gently with my thumb. And if I feel like there's any movement or the clay gives in ever so slightly, I know I can't go any deeper. Once I'm happy with the finesse of the foot, I burnish all the edges around the bottom so they're nice and smooth, and any coarse particles of sand, which this clay body does contain, are pushed back into the stoneware. I then stamp the pot with my maker's mark and rock it gently from corner to corner so it leaves a clear impression. I then do a touch more burnishing, especially on the top, as by stamping my maker's mark some clay was displaced upwards, creating a tiny bump, so I push that back down. I blast the foot with a heat gun for a few seconds just to take the soft edge off the clay, so whatever material I place this pot on doesn't embed itself into the foot. For instance, with my wooden wearboards, if I place a freshly trimmed pot onto one of those, the grain of wood can stamp itself ever so slightly into the soft clay. I run this kidney over the rim just to soften it, and with that, the pot is finally complete. And let's weigh it to see just how much clay was removed. So at 508 grams, that means I've removed 321 grams in total, which is just over 11 ounces. This means that roughly a third of the initial thrown weight was removed during this process, and the pot went from feeling rather heavy to light and balanced. Trimming is my favourite part of the process. It's the process of refinement, and it tends to be a more mechanical, careful process as compared to throwing, which is probably why I prefer it more. You also don't get anywhere near as messy, which, as a potter, makes for a welcome change. I'll now let this bowl sit under plastic to dry out slowly for a couple of days, and then it will be bisque-fired, waxed, glazed, and reduction-fired to 1290 degrees Celsius. I hope you found this more informative video helpful, and if you did happen to make it to the end, do let me know, as it's always interesting to see just how many people do. Anyhow, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you next week.